I found out my husband was putting medication in my coffee every night for 5 years, and when I got close to discovering the truth, he almost killed me. Hi, my name is Mirabelle. I'm 71 years old, and I'm here to tell a story that completely changed my life. A story that happened when I was 34 years old, when I was still an investigative journalist, working for one of the biggest news outlets in the country. I'm someone who worked with facts, with evidence, with documentation my entire life. I don't believe in coincidences, and what happened to me for 5 years was anything but a coincidence. First of all, I wanted to ask you to like this video, because this story needs to be seen by many people. Subscribe to the Grandma's Diary channel too, because I'll continue telling real stories that happen to ordinary people like you and me. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what state, what country, because I love knowing that this story is reaching people from all over the world. Now I'll start from the point where everything began to get strange. Everything started approximately 37 years ago, when I was at the peak of my career. I had just closed a major investigative piece about corruption in public contracts and was very happy with my personal life too. Theodore, my husband, had left his job as a manager a few years earlier to take care of his mother, who had advanced Alzheimer's. He was an attentive, caring man, always worried about me, or at least that's what I thought at the time. Now, looking back at 71 years old, I can say I was a naive woman. I was a woman who believed the world was better than it really is. The first strange thing started with that morning ritual we had. Every single day, absolutely every day, Theodore would wake up before me and prepare 2 coffees. Freshly brewed coffee. Real coffee, the kind where you can smell the aroma wafting through the kitchen. He said he had brought a special blend from an exclusive farm in the interior of North Carolina. An expensive, sophisticated coffee that he only prepared for me because I was special. I loved that ritual. It was like a warm hug I received every morning of my life. But soon after I started drinking his coffee, things began to get strange with myself. I would wake up absolutely exhausted, and it's not normal tiredness, you know? It's that kind of tiredness where you sleep 8 hours at night and still wake up feeling like you only slept for 2. My eyes would get heavy. My head hurt constantly, and I had this light dizziness all the time, as if I was always on a moving boat. I started blaming work, because journalists really do work a lot. There's pressure, there are deadlines, there are people wanting to threaten you because they didn't like the story you published. That's normal in my profession. But then came other symptoms. I would lose memory of things I had done. For example, I would arrive home after a day of work and couldn't remember if I had eaten anything or not. My coworker, Marcus, told me that in a meeting I had given an opinion about a subject, and 20 minutes later he asked me a question about the same thing I had talked about, and I didn't remember anything. I found that very strange at the time. My mood also changed a lot. I became a much more docile, much more passive person. Things that would previously make me furious and ready for an argument, now I would just let pass. For example, Theodore started asking me to drop some university work I was doing in a specialization course. He would say, "You already work all day, honey. Why stress yourself out even more?" And I would agree without thinking much. That wasn't me. I'm a woman who always fought for my goals. The headaches became so severe that I had to go to 3 different neurologists. All of them did MRIs, CT scans, every exam you can imagine. Nothing showed up. The doctors said it was probably anxiety, stress indeed, and prescribed me tranquilizers. I would take those tranquilizers and get even worse, much worse. Theodore, meanwhile, was perfect. He took care of me when I was unwell, brought me water, helped me lie down in bed. He would hug me and say that everything would pass, that it was just a difficult moment. And I believed him, because why wouldn't I believe him? He was my husband, the person I chose to spend the rest of my life with. But there's something important I need to tell you. During those 5 years, Theodore's mother was very sick. She had very advanced Alzheimer's, and Theodore was the one who took care of her during the day. She had many medications, many indeed, sleep medications, anxiety medications to control the aggressive behaviors she had with the disease. And all those medications were kept in the kitchen cabinet, right next to where Theodore prepared my coffee. I never found that strange at the time. Why would I find it strange? Medications in a kitchen cabinet is very common in elderly people's homes. My work began to suffer. I had difficulty concentrating on my investigations. My articles came out with lower quality than they normally did. My boss started commenting that I wasn't well, that something was wrong. He even offered me a leave of absence, but Theodore advised me not to accept it, saying that in journalism a leave can cost your career. So I continued going to work with that tiredness, that dizziness, that feeling of living in slow motion. The worst part is that I started to distrust myself. I thought I was developing some mental illness, maybe depression, maybe something neurological. I felt weak, I felt dependent, and I didn't like this version of myself. But at the same time, I couldn't do anything to change that. It was as if my body no longer obeyed my own brain. My sex life with Theodore also changed. I had no desire. My body didn't respond. And he, who was previously very passionate about me, started being much more distant, much colder. He spent too much time in the home office, locked away. Sometimes I would hear him on the phone talking about strange things, quietly, whispering. But when I asked, he said it was just an old work friend talking about business. 5 years. That's 5 years living like this. 5 years waking up tired, 5 years with constant headaches, 5 years becoming a shadow of myself, 5 years drinking that coffee I loved, but that was slowly destroying my body and mind. Now, at 71 years old, I can see that period with clarity. I can identify all the signs I missed, all the red flags I should have seen. But at that time, when I was 34 years old, when I was younger and perhaps too trusting of the people around me, I couldn't see any of it. The doctor told me years later that the medications Theodore was giving me affected not only my body, but also my capacity for critical thinking, that those specific medications, when dosed chronically, cause a decrease in the ability to perceive danger, that I literally couldn't think clearly enough to distrust him, that this was part of the plan. I received a lot of guilt afterwards, a lot of self-blame for having let that happen for so long. But over time, I learned that guilt is a luxury that victims cannot afford. Guilt belongs only to the one who did evil, and the one who did evil was Theodore, no one else. And then came that day that changed everything. That day when I discovered the truth that was hidden at the bottom of a coffee cup. It was a rainy Tuesday, March 14th, 1987. I remember the exact day because there was an important meeting scheduled at the newspaper, and I was nervous because I knew my performance wasn't good. I had woken up tired, as usual, and Theodore was already in the kitchen doing that ritual we had. I could hear him moving the containers, the sound of hot water, that familiar sound that was already part of my routine since I woke up. But that morning was different. That morning I woke up with a strange sensation. It wasn't physical. It was more mental. I was lying in bed, looking at the ceiling, and suddenly I had a thought I had never had before. What if it wasn't work? What if it wasn't my health? What if it was something else? It seems crazy to think about it now, but at that moment that thought came like lightning. Today, at 71 years old, I'm able to analyze that thought as something that came from a very deep place, a place that the medications couldn't reach completely, a place that was still mine, even though I was being poisoned. My instinct was still working, even if very slowly. My body was still trying to alert me to something very wrong. I got up from bed and went to the bathroom. I looked at my face in the mirror. I was thin, very thin. My face had lost weight. My skin was pale. I didn't recognize the woman who was looking at me in that mirror. That wasn't me. I'm a woman who always took care of my appearance, who loved herself. And at that moment, I felt such deep sadness that I almost collapsed. Theodore knocked on the bathroom door and asked if I was okay. I said yes, that I was just getting ready. He replied that the coffee was ready, that he had prepared my special coffee. That word, special, started echoing in my head in a very strange way. I went downstairs and entered the kitchen. Theodore was there, facing the window, drinking his cup of coffee. He was wearing those clothes he always wore when taking care of his mother, a comfortable t-shirt and sweatpants. He gave me that smile I knew so well, that smile that said, "Good morning, my love. How are you?" I felt something strange at that moment. It wasn't logical, it wasn't rational, but I felt it. My coffee was in a white ceramic cup, that cup he had brought from a trip to Europe years ago. My coffee was steaming, smelling that aroma I knew. And his cup, that glass cup he always used, was on the kitchen table, also steaming. I did something I would never have done normally. I don't know if it was instinct, intuition, or that strange feeling I had, but I looked at Theodore and said, "Honey, I'm so tired of this routine. You know what? Today I want to try your coffee, the one you always drink. Can I?" Theodore turned to me with an expression I had never seen before on his face. It was quick, very quick, a fraction of a second. But I saw it, I saw fear, I saw panic. Then he disguised it and smiled, but that smile wasn't natural. He said, "My love, it's not that special. Yours is much better. You know yours is much more sophisticated," I insisted. I said I really wanted to try it, that I was tired of always drinking the same thing, that I wanted to try something new. Theodore started making excuses. He said that coffee had a very bitter taste, that it was made for his palate, that it was different. He said he had bought that coffee in a huge package and needed to use it all before the expiration date. But I insisted even more, because at that moment I realized that something very wrong was happening, and that something had to do with that coffee. I took my cup and made a motion to switch. Theodore moved fast, very fast. He extended his hand and tried to physically stop me. He said with a voice I had never heard come from him, a firmer, more aggressive voice, "Mirabelle, no, please, don't do that." At that moment, everything became clear. Everything made sense. All those 5 years, all that tiredness, all that dizziness, all that feeling of losing my control, everything was connected. In that second, when I saw the fear in his eyes, when I heard that voice that wasn't the caring voice I knew he was doing something to me, something deliberate, something evil. But I didn't let him see that I understood. This was important. I took a deep breath and did something I learned in all those years working as an investigative journalist. I pretended I accepted. I smiled and said, "Okay, dear, you're right. Your coffee does taste very bitter. I'll stick with mine." Theodore relaxed. Visually, I could see his shoulders drop. He breathed deeply too, and he did something that froze me inside. He took my cup, the one he had prepared for me, and placed it in front of him, and he took a sip. He took a sip of his own coffee, the coffee he had given me to drink. And at that moment, I realized something very important. He didn't know which was which. He had one cup in front of him and one cup in front of me, and he didn't know which was which, because I had made the proposal to switch. Theodore took that sip, and his expression changed completely. He made a disgusted face. He put his hand to his mouth and almost spat. He ran to the kitchen sink and poured out the rest of that cup. He stood there holding the sink, breathing heavily. I pretended I hadn't seen anything. I took the other cup, the one that was in front of me, which I now knew was his normal coffee, and took a sip. It was completely normal coffee, with no strange taste, without that medicinal bitterness I had been drinking for 5 whole years. Theodore turned to me and asked with a voice that tried to be casual, but was trembling, "How's the coffee?" I said, "Delicious, exactly as always." And I smiled. I smiled at him while my whole body was shaking, while my heart was racing so much that I was sure he could hear it from where he was. Theodore sat down next to me. He apologized for reacting that way. He said he had a headache and that bitter coffee made his pain much worse. He hugged me and kissed my head and said he loved me. And I let him do all that while my brain was working at maximum speed. I had 5 years of life to decipher. I had to discover exactly what he was putting in that coffee. I had to understand why. And most importantly, I had to do this without him knowing that I knew. That morning, before going to work, I did something that may seem simple, but was very important. When Theodore went to check on his mother in the living room, I quickly entered the kitchen. I searched in every cabinet, every drawer, every place where he could be keeping something. And then I found it. In the cabinet above the sink, right next to the coffee, was a medication bottle. It was a prescription bottle. The name was difficult, something that started with Flurazep. I recognized that medication because my own doctor had prescribed it to me once years ago when I had insomnia. It was a sedative, a very strong tranquilizer, the kind of thing you take at night to sleep, and that leaves you very drowsy the next day. I carefully took the bottle, trying not to make noise. The prescription date was from 3 months ago. The name on the prescription was Theodore's mother's name. She had died 2 years ago, but he still had that medication. He still had that expired medication and was using it, putting it in my coffee every morning. My hands started shaking. I had to put the bottle back in place, exactly as it was, with care not to leave dust marks or any sign that I had touched it. Theodore returned to the kitchen moments later, asking where I was. I said I was getting ready to go to work. He gave me a goodbye kiss. That kiss that was previously affectionate, but now, knowing what I knew, seemed poisonous. That morning, on the way to work, I did something that would probably seem strange to most people. I was driving to the newspaper, but my thoughts were completely elsewhere. I thought about calling the police, but what if I was wrong? What if that didn't mean what I thought it meant? He could have an explanation. It could be something innocent. It could be. No, it wasn't innocent. Nobody puts medication in someone's coffee for 5 years by accident. I arrived at work and pretended normalcy. I sat at my desk, opened my computer, and looked at the blank screen. Normally, I would have story ideas flowing in my mind. Normally, I would be doing research, developing stories, investigating things, but that day, my brain was occupied with just one investigation. The investigation of a secret my husband was keeping. I needed proof. I needed scientific confirmation. I needed someone I could trust to analyze that coffee and tell me exactly what was in it. And I knew exactly who I should look for. My best friend Cassandra was a doctor. More specifically, she was a toxicologist. She worked at a private hospital in the city, doing substance analysis in cases of poisoning, overdose, and forensic investigations. If anyone could help me, it was her. But I had to be careful. I had to be discreet. I couldn't simply go to Cassandra and tell her I thought my husband was poisoning me. Because if I was wrong, if that was just my paranoia, I would be destroying my marriage for nothing. And if I was right, I had to gather all possible evidence before making any move. During that entire day, I made a plan in my mind. A plan that involved risk, that involved pretending for more time, but that was necessary. On the night of March 14th, when I returned home, Theodore was waiting for me at the door. He had made my favorite dish for dinner. He was being very attentive. And while I ate that food he had prepared, I wondered, could there be something there too? Could he be putting things in my food too? That thought scared me more than anything I had been through up to that moment. Today, at 71 years old, when I look back at that period, I can clearly see how crucial that day was. That day was the turning point. That day was when I stopped being just a passive victim and started being someone who was fighting for her own life, because I finally knew. I finally had the answer to that question that haunted me. Why was I so tired? Why was I so confused? Why had my life collapsed that way? And that answer, however terrible it was better than living in the void of ignorance. That night was one of the longest of my life. I pretended to sleep next to Theodore, but my whole body was on maximum alert. My heart was beating fast, my mind wouldn't stop thinking, and every movement he made me tense. When he snores, he has always snored since we've known each other. That night, that snoring that used to calm me, that used to be like familiar music, now scared me. Because I knew that while he slept peacefully, I was there awake, discovering that everything I thought about my marriage was a lie. At dawn, I got up from bed with extreme care. I didn't put my feet where the bed creaks. I already knew, after so many years, exactly where to step to not wake him. I went down the stairs slowly and went to the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator and took the coffee pitcher that Theodore had prepared the day before. He always prepares coffee in a glass pitcher and leaves it in the refrigerator for the next day, so he doesn't have to make hot coffee every morning. That pitcher, that coffee, that was what I had to take to Cassandra. I took a small glass jar we had at home, one we used to store spice things. I put a reasonable amount of coffee in that jar and then put the pitcher back in the refrigerator, exactly in the same place, at the same angle, as if nothing had happened. I put the jar in a bag I use for work, a black leather bag that Theodore never touches. My plan was simple, but risky. I had to take that coffee to Cassandra. I had to ask her to analyze it discreetly, without leaving official records that could be tracked, and I had to do all this without Theodore suspecting. Because if he discovered I knew, if he realized I was investigating, I don't know what he would do. That thought froze me. I don't know what he would do. That phrase echoed in my mind throughout that dawn. I spent the entire night imagining scenarios, dark scenarios, scenarios I didn't even want to think about, but my brain insisted on creating. Now, at 71 years old, I can say that fear was justified, because I discovered later that Theodore had considered various ways to get rid of me, ways that involved accidents, ways that involved making it look like I had gone insane. The poisoning was just the beginning of a much more sinister plan. In the morning, when I woke up, Theodore was sleeping beside me. I observed him for a few minutes. That man I thought I knew better than anyone in the world. That man I promised to love forever. That man who was slowly poisoning my body while whispering that he loved me. I didn't drink the coffee that morning. Theodore asked why. I lied and said I had a stomachache, that coffee would make it worse. He accepted the excuse without questioning. At work, during the morning, I sent a message to Cassandra. We always communicated by phone because it was more discreet. I asked if she had time to have lunch with me that day. She replied yes, that we could meet at the restaurant near the hospital where she worked. During those hours of waiting, I couldn't concentrate on anything. My boss passed by my desk and asked if everything was okay with me. I said yes, that it was just a migraine that was passing. He offered for me to leave early, but I refused. I didn't want to leave work because I needed to keep up appearances. If I started acting differently, if I started missing work, complaining, showing signs that something was wrong, Theodore might suspect. That balance I had to maintain was fragile, very fragile. At noon, I left work and went to the restaurant. Cassandra was already sitting at a corner table, away from other customers. She's an intelligent woman, and when I see her, she immediately notices something is wrong. We've been friends for more than 15 years, since college. She knows me too well for me to be able to fool her. When I sat down, she immediately asked, "What happened?" I took a deep breath, and at that moment I decided to tell her the truth. Not everything, but enough for her to understand the gravity of the situation. I said I thought something was very wrong with my coffee, that for 5 years I had been drinking coffee that left me very tired, with dizziness and constant headaches, that a few days ago I discovered that Theodore's coffee was completely different, that I didn't know what was in my coffee. But I was sure there was something there, that it could be a joke of his, could be something he didn't realize he was doing, but I needed to know. Cassandra listened to me with total attention. She asked me to tell her how I discovered that. I told her about the cup switch, about Theodore's reaction, about the medication bottle I found. When I finished telling, Cassandra was quiet for a few seconds. Then, she asked if I had the coffee with me. I took the jar from my bag and placed it on the table between us. She took the jar and observed it. She moved the coffee inside the jar, seeing the color, the consistency. Then she asked, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because once I analyze this, everything changes. You understand that?" I said yes. I said I needed to know, that I couldn't live with that doubt anymore, that I needed answers. Cassandra put the jar in her bag. She said she could do the analysis, but it had to be discreet, that she couldn't use the hospital equipment because she would have to fill out forms, documentation, everything would be recorded. But she knew a colleague, a toxicologist who had a private practice, who could do that analysis confidentially. I thanked her. I thanked her so much that I almost started crying there in that restaurant. Cassandra held my hand across the table and said everything would be okay, that whatever the result was, she was there with me. That lunch was quick. We ate little because neither of us had an appetite. When we said goodbye, Cassandra hugged me and whispered that she loved me, that she was there with me. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. 3 days of waiting, 3 days of continuing to pretend nothing had happened. 3 days of drinking coffee prepared by Theodore again, because if I stopped drinking it, he would suspect. So I drank it. I put that cup to my lips. I drank that coffee I now knew was poisoned. And I pretended everything was okay, because being certain of the truth was more important than protecting my body for a few days. Theodore continued being attentive. He continued hugging me, kissing me, whispering words of love. And every gesture that was previously comforting now was a stab in my heart, because every kiss was a lie, every hug was a betrayal, and I had to continue pretending I didn't know anything. On Wednesday night, Cassandra called me to talk. She asked me to go to a discreet place, an inn that had a bar on the first floor, a place where nobody knew us. We agreed I would arrive there around 9 p.m. when Theodore would already be sleeping. That night, I pretended I was very tired. I said I was going to sleep early. Theodore prepared my coffee one last time before I went to sleep, and I drank it as if it were the most normal thing in the world. About an hour later, when I was sure he was sleeping deeply, I took my car keys and left the house. The way to the inn took 20 minutes. My heart was racing with every kilometer. I thought about all the possibilities. What if Cassandra had found something so serious that she had decided she would have to notify the authorities? What if the result had shown it wasn't just a tranquilizer, but something much worse? What if I had been poisoned with multiple substances for 5 years? When I arrived at the inn, Cassandra was already waiting for me. She had a paper folder in her hand. She asked us to talk in a more private place, and we went to one of the small rooms the inn had for meetings. We sat face to face. Cassandra opened the folder and started talking. She said she had taken the coffee to be analyzed at a private laboratory of a trusted colleague, that the analysis had taken 2 days because they had to run specific tests to identify the substances, and the result had come that morning. In the coffee I had been drinking for 5 years, there was a concentration of flurazepam, not a small amount that could be accidental contamination. It was a deliberate amount, specifically dosed, to be enough to cause chronic sedation, but not enough to be easily detected in a standard blood test. Cassandra explained that flurazepam is a benzodiazepine, a sedative, that when you take it for 5 years in small doses every day, your body develops a tolerance that explains why I hadn't fainted, why I could do my basic activities, but why I had that constant tiredness, that dizziness, that memory loss. But there was more. The analysis had also detected traces of another medication, a medication called amitriptyline. It was a tricyclic antidepressant that, when combined with the benzodiazepine, caused even more potent effects of sedation and emotional dependency. I felt the ground disappear under my feet. It wasn't one tranquilizer, it was 2 medications. 2 different medications, deliberately combined to have maximum effect. Cassandra continued talking. She said that the combination of those 2 medications had a very specific effect. They made the person docile, dependent, unable to think clearly, and that in the long term they caused neurological damage. That some of the symptoms I was feeling, the memory loss, the difficulty concentrating, that could be permanent if it continued. I couldn't answer anything. I was in shock. My whole body was shaking. Cassandra took my hand and said she had one more piece of information, that she had researched the medications Theodore's mother had taken when she was alive, and that her prescription included exactly those two medications, that she had died 2 years ago. But Theodore still had those medications stored, and he was using exactly those medications that had been prescribed for his mother. At that moment, I realized. At that moment, everything became clear. Theodore hadn't simply thought of doing this. He had had time to think. He had had access to the medications, and, most importantly, he had had 5 years to plan this, because he started that special coffee exactly in the same period he started taking care of his mother. Cassandra asked what I was going to do. If I was going to the police, if I was going to confront Theodore, if I was going to look for a lawyer. I didn't know. At that moment, I didn't know anything anymore. I only knew that the life I thought I had, that lasted 22 years of relationship with Theodore, was a lie. Everything was a lie. And I still had to go home and continue pretending I didn't know anything, because I still hadn't discovered why. Why he was doing that, what the final objective was. I had to understand the mind of a man I loved enough to marry, but who betrayed me in the cruelest way possible for 5 whole years. Today, at 71 years old, I can say that private laboratory saved my life. Those toxicological tests were the difference between continuing to be poisoned to death or discovering the truth in time. Cassandra took me back home that night. I asked her to drop me off a few blocks away so Theodore wouldn't suspect. When I got home, he was sleeping. I lay down next to him and spent another sleepless night, but this time it was different. This time I had proof. This time I was certain, and that certainty, however painful it was, gave me a sense of power, because now I was no longer someone who was being deceived. Now I was someone who knew exactly what was happening, and I was going to do something about it. I went back home that night, in a state I can't even describe with words. It was as if I was driving my car on autopilot, because my brain had completely shut down. My body knew the way home, but my mind was somewhere else. It was in a dark place, full of questions I couldn't answer. When I entered the house, Theodore was sleeping. I went up the stairs slowly and lay down next to him. He continued sleeping deeply, that peaceful, carefree sleep. And I stayed there lying, watching his face in the darkness, trying to find in that face the answer to a very simple question. Why? Why would a man you think loves you do something of that magnitude? Why would he put his own body at risk? Because using expired medications that had been prescribed for another person, that had risks. That had side effects I couldn't even imagine. The night was sleepless. I didn't sleep a single minute. I just lay there in the dark, my brain working at 1,000 miles an hour, connecting dots that didn't make sense before. And then I started remembering things, little things I had dismissed at the time, that I had thought were normal, but now made a lot of sense. 3 years ago, Theodore had asked me to sign some documents. Documents, he said, were for life insurance, routine things couples did. I signed without even reading properly. I trusted him, and at that moment, lying in that bed, I wondered what the value of that insurance was, how much I was worth dead to him. 2 years ago, when Theodore's mother died, he received an inheritance. It wasn't a huge inheritance, but it was significant. Some real estate, a bank account with a considerable amount. And soon after he received that inheritance, he started talking about leaving his job as a manager. He said he wanted to take care of me, that he had had the opportunity to retire early because of the inheritance. But what if that wasn't everything? What if there was more money involved? A year ago, Theodore started spending a lot of time in the office. He said he was studying to get a certification in investment management. He spent hours there, doors closed, telling me not to bother him. But I had never seen any certification come from that. No course completion. Nothing. 6 months ago, Theodore started asking me to sign more documents. This time, documents related to our joint bank account. He said he wanted to make an international transfer, that he was thinking of investing in property in another country. Again, I signed because I was taking medications that left me unable to think clearly, because I was docile, because I was easy to manipulate. That dawn, I got up from bed without making noise. Theodore continued sleeping. I went to his office, that office that was practically sacred to him, where I rarely entered. I opened the door slowly. The room was, as always, with that smell of old wood and paper. There was a large mahogany desk, a computer, various files in cardboard folders on the shelves. I started searching. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew there was something there, something that explained everything. In the desk drawers, I found bank statements, many statements. My eyes started following the numbers, and I noticed something very wrong. There were money transfers I hadn't authorized. International transfers to accounts in names I didn't recognize. Very large numbers, much larger than the money Theodore should have available. I searched more. In the cardboard folders, I found property documents. A house in Miami I had never seen before. An apartment in Barcelona I didn't know existed. All this in names that weren't mine or his, company names that seemed like fronts. And then I found something that made me freeze completely. It was a blue folder hidden behind other documents. Inside it, there were photos. Photos of me sleeping, photos of me drinking coffee, photos of me in various stages of intoxication, with half-closed eyes, disoriented. There were dozens of them, hundreds maybe. Each photo had a date. The date started exactly 5 years ago. Next to the photos, there was a text file, a file that had notes, dates, descriptions of how I was each day. Day 47. Increased mental confusion. Started forgetting appointments. Day 128. Evident emotional dependency. Accepted leaving specialization course without protesting. Day 243. Signed insurance documents without questioning. Day 356. Successful transfer of $50,000 to offshore account. That wasn't a relationship. It was an experiment. It was a project. I was a project. My body started shaking. My vision became blurred. I had to support myself on the desk to not fall. Today, at 71 years old, when I retell this part of the story, my body still feels that tremor. My heart still beats fast. Because discovering that you were documented as an experiment, that every moment of your physical and mental deterioration was meticulously recorded, that leaves a scar that never heals completely. Those records showed that Theodore had monitored everything. He had noted every bank transfer he made me sign. He had noted every moment my mental confusion increased. He had taken photos of me at my worst moments, as if he were collecting trophies. And then I heard a voice coming from behind me. "You shouldn't be here." Theodore's voice, calm, cold. A voice I had never heard before, or rather, I had heard it that morning when he tried to stop me from switching the cups. That voice that wasn't the caring voice I knew. I turned slowly. Theodore was at the office door wearing a gray bathrobe. His eyes had no emotion. Those eyes, I thought, carried love, that carried devotion. Those eyes now seemed empty. He entered the office and closed the door behind him. He moved slowly in my direction. I asked with a voice that wasn't mine, "Why?" Theodore took a deep breath, and at that moment he started telling a story I never expected to hear. He said that when we got married, he had a debt, a very large debt, with very dangerous people, people who had lent him money to invest in a business that went wrong. And those people, they wanted the money back with interest. And the interest was growing every day that passed. He said he didn't know what to do, that he was desperate. And that's when he met a man in a bar, a man who offered a solution to his problem. That man knew people who had a very lucrative scheme, a scheme that involved finding rich people, people with access to money, people who were vulnerable, and then transforming them into puppets. The scheme was like this. You approach the person, you conquer them, you make them fall in love with you. Then you put medications in their coffee, something that makes the person docile, dependent, unable to think clearly. And while they're in that state, you access their bank accounts, you make them transfer money, you make them sign documents, you drain them completely. And when you finish draining, when there's no more money to take, You have several options. You can simply disappear. You can make it look like the person had a mental illness. You can make it look like an accident. Theodore said all that as if he were reciting a story he had heard, not as if he were admitting he had done that to me. He continued saying that man had recruited him, that he needed to do that to pay his debt, that it was just business, that nothing was personal, that if he didn't do it, the people he owed money would kill him, that they would kill me too. I asked about his mother, about that care he was always giving. Theodore laughed, a laugh that gave me chills. He said his mother had died naturally, yes, but that before dying, he had practically done the same thing to her, that he had inherited more money than people thought. At that moment, I realized I wasn't married to a man. I was married to a psychopath, someone who was capable of poisoning his own mother, of manipulating his own mother while pretending to care for her. Theodore approached me closer. He asked if I had told anyone, if I had said anything to Cassandra. I didn't answer. My mouth couldn't move. He took the blue folder from my hand. He put it back in its place, among the other documents. Then he looked me in the eyes and said something that left me even more terrified. You know, Mirabelle, you were much more resistant than I expected. Most women would have progressed further in the plan by now. You continued investigating for newspapers, continued with your career. That was a problem. You knew people. You had contacts. You had a voice that could be heard. He said he would have to accelerate the process, that he couldn't allow me to continue in that state of semi-consciousness anymore, that he had to do something more definitive. I started mentally running through all the possibilities, all the ways this could end, and none of them had a happy ending for me. Theodore asked me to go back to bed. He said tomorrow would be an important day, that I should rest, that he had something prepared for me. That something prepared echoed in my mind, and I understood at that moment that Cassandra was right, that once you know the truth, everything changes. Because now I was no longer someone who was being passively poisoned. I was someone who knew I was being poisoned, and I had to make a decision. I could pretend I didn't know anything and wait to see what Theodore would do. Or I could do something now, something that could save me, something that could protect other women who might be his next victims. That night, while lying next to him again, I put my plan into motion, a plan that involved immense risk, a plan that involved deceiving a man who had already deceived me so profoundly, a plan that involved exposure, but it was my only path to survive. Today, when I think about that moment, I'm surprised by my own survival instinct. Because despite being poisoned, despite being confused, despite being scared, I managed to think clearly enough to make a plan that required me to pretend perfect normalcy, that I hide my knowledge, that I act as if nothing had happened. Because I knew that if Theodore realized I had discovered everything, he would kill me that night. He would have no choice, because I was a threat, because I knew the truth. The next morning, I woke up and pretended nothing had happened. Theodore prepared my coffee. I didn't drink it. I said I had nausea, that I couldn't eat or drink anything. He seemed disappointed, but didn't insist. During that day, while Theodore was busy elsewhere in the house, I did something that could change everything. I took my phone, I called Cassandra from a place where Theodore couldn't hear me, and I asked her to do something very specific. I asked her to go to the police station and file a formal complaint. I asked her to inform them that she had analyzed a coffee sample that contained benzodiazepines and antidepressants. I asked her to give my home address, and I asked her to inform them that my husband could be involved in deliberate poisoning. Cassandra asked if I was sure, if I really wanted to do that, because once the police were called, there was no turning back. I said yes, that I was sure, that I preferred to die fighting than to continue living that nightmare. And then I waited. I waited for that knock on the door that would change everything, because I knew that once the police arrived, Theodore wouldn't have the opportunity to harm me. Once he was interrogated, once the evidence was presented, everything would be out of his control. That day was the day I stopped being a victim and started being a survivor. The police arrived at 4 p.m. I heard the sound of tires on the asphalt, the sound of cars stopping in front of my house. My heart started beating so fast, I thought I was going to have a heart attack at that moment. I was in the kitchen pretending I was organizing the cabinets. Theodore was in the office as always. When the knock on the door came, he ran out of the office. He asked who it was. I didn't answer. I just stood there with my hands shaking. Theodore opened the door and saw two police officers, a man and a woman, both uniformed, both with that serious expression police officers have when they're going to make an arrest. The male officer asked if he was Theodore Montero. Theodore said yes, with a voice that was already starting to tremble. The officer said he needed to accompany them to answer some questions related to possible poisoning, that he had the right to remain silent, that anything he said could be used against him in court. Theodore looked at me at that moment, and in that look, I saw everything. I saw anger. I saw panic. I saw the certainty that his plan had completely collapsed. He was arrested. They put him in one of the police cars and took him away. That night, the police returned with a search warrant. They searched the entire house, found the expired medications in the cabinet, found the bank statements in the office, found the photos, found all the documentation Theodore had kept. One of the officers, a woman called Detective Helena, sat with me and asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint, if I wanted to press charges against my husband. I said yes, that I wanted him to be held accountable for everything he had done. The detective asked how long I had been drinking that poisoned coffee. I said 5 years. The detective closed her eyes for a moment, as if that number was too much for her to process. Then she asked if there were other victims I knew, if there were other women who might be going through the same thing. I didn't know, but I had that file Theodore had kept, that file with notes and dates. And in that file there were references to other women, names I didn't recognize, dates that didn't make sense with me. The police started investigating. They discovered that Theodore hadn't acted alone, that he was part of a larger network, an international network of scammers that specialized in seducing wealthy women or women with access to money, drugging them with medications and draining their bank accounts. The network had cells in several countries: United States, Argentina, Spain, Portugal, Italy. In total, they discovered that Theodore had done this to 5 different women. 5 women who had disappeared, who had died under suspicious circumstances, or who were still in psychiatric hospitals because they had developed severe mental problems because of the medications they had taken for years. When I learned this, I collapsed. I simply collapsed on the floor, my whole body shaking, because I realized I had been lucky. I had survived. I had discovered in time. But those other women hadn't had the same luck. The toxicological tests Cassandra had done became crucial evidence. They showed exactly what substance was in the coffee. They proved it wasn't accidental contamination. This was deliberate poisoning. Theodore was charged with poisoning, fraud, embezzlement, and, in the case of one of the other women who had died, he was also charged with involuntary manslaughter. The prosecution was considering charges of voluntary manslaughter too, because he had documented everything, because this had been a premeditated plan for years. The media exploited that story like nothing I had seen before. Despite being a journalist and knowing how the media works, despite knowing how stories are amplified and distorted, nothing prepared me to see my personal story being spread across newspapers, on television programs, on social media. I received messages from women all over the United States saying my story had saved them. Women who recognized the signs, women who were being poisoned too, who were being manipulated, who managed to get out of those situations because they saw my story. But I also received messages from people who didn't believe me, people who said I was exaggerating, people who asked why I had waited 5 years to do something, people who blamed me, as if I were responsible for letting a man poison my coffee. The trial took 2 years. 2 years of hearings, of witnesses, of documentation being presented. Cassandra testified about the toxicological test results. Detective Helena testified about the evidence found. The investigators testified about the other victims they had found. Theodore maintained the defense that he had acted under coercion, that he was being forced by the criminal network to do that that he didn't want to do that if he didn't do it, he would be killed. But the evidence was very clear. The photos he had taken, the documents he had made, the meticulous notes about every step. That wasn't the behavior of someone who was being coerced. That was the behavior of someone who was proud of what he was doing. Theodore was sentenced to 19 years in prison. 19 years. For each of the 5 years he poisoned me, he would get approximately 3 years and 8 months in jail. That didn't seem fair. That didn't seem enough, but it was what the law allowed. I was in the courtroom when the sentence was read. I looked at Theodore at that moment, and he looked at me. And that look, even after everything that had happened, even after all the truth had been revealed, that look still had a trace of that man I thought I knew. But I knew that man had never existed. That man had been just a construction, a character he had created to deceive me. In the months following the trial, I had to recover. And recovery is a word that can't describe what that was. My body had accumulated damage from the medications. My brain neurons had been affected. My doctor said some of the damage could be permanent, that I could have memory difficulties for the rest of my life, that my reflexes might never return completely to normal. I spent 6 months in a rehabilitation program, a specific program for victims of chronic poisoning. There I met other women who had gone through similar things, who had been poisoned in different ways by people who were supposed to love them. One of them, a woman named Paula, had been poisoned for 5 years with arsenic. Another man, a boyfriend, had slowly put arsenic in her food. She had developed cancer because of it. She was in stage 4 when she discovered. Another woman, Fernanda, had been poisoned by her mother, her own mother, for 15 years. The objective was to keep Fernanda medicated enough so she couldn't develop emotionally, so she would remain dependent. Hearing those stories was at the same time devastating and comforting. Devastating because there was so much evil in the world. Comforting because I wasn't alone, because there were other people who had gone through things as horrible as what I had gone through. The program had therapy, had doctors, had frequent neurological tests. They monitored my recovery, trying to evaluate how much damage had been done and how much could be recovered. My brain was slower, my short-term memory was compromised. But with time, with therapy, with correctly prescribed medications, this time, things started to improve. At the same time, I underwent a psychological evaluation that discovered I had developed PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That made sense. I had lived through a traumatic situation. I had discovered that the person I loved, that I trusted more than anyone else in the world, had consciously poisoned me every day for 5 years. Trust is a very fragile thing, and when you discover that trust has been betrayed in such a fundamental way, it's very difficult to rebuild. My work as a journalist also suffered. I returned to the newspaper after 2 years when the trial had ended, but I couldn't investigate stories the same way anymore. I was afraid of being close to people I didn't know well, afraid of eating something someone had prepared for me. My boss suggested I take a leave, that maybe it would be better for me to take time to recover completely. But I refused. I decided I would continue, that I would transform what had happened to me into something meaningful. I started writing about chronic poisoning, about how to identify signs, about how women and men can recognize when something is wrong. My articles were published in several important newspapers. They reached millions of people. And with that, more victims came out of silence, more stories emerged. The police started receiving more reports of possible poisonings. The criminal network Theodore was part of was being dismantled, cell by cell. 6 months ago, the police arrested other members of that network, men who had done exactly what Theodore did. Women too, because there were women in that network. Women who recruited other women, who poisoned them, who manipulated them. The house where I lived, that house where I woke up every morning to drink poisoned coffee, I sold. I couldn't live there anymore. Every room had a bad memory. Every day was a reminder of what Theodore had done. With the money from the sale, I started a foundation for victims of chronic poisoning and domestic abuse. The foundation helps women get out of abusive relationships, provides therapy, provides medical monitoring. My relationship with my parents also changed. They had been neglectful with me during that period. They hadn't noticed something was wrong. They would come visit and I was visually different, but they didn't ask. After everything was discovered, Mother fell into depression. She blamed herself for not seeing. Father was furious. He wanted to go to jail and do justice with his own hands. It took time, but we rebuilt that relationship because my parents were also victims in a way. Victims of the fact that someone had deceived all of us. Cassandra became much more than my best friend. She became my sister because she saved my life. Because she believed me when I could have easily been dismissed as a paranoid and confused woman, because she had the courage to go to the police, knowing that could bring problems for her too. Sometimes I still have nightmares. Nightmares where I'm drinking that poisoned coffee, where I discover Theodore is there, where he's coming towards me. I wake up sweaty, with my heart racing. My therapist says that's normal, that it will pass with time, but I'm realistic. I'm a journalist. I'm someone who works with facts. And the fact is that trauma doesn't disappear. You learn to live with it. You learn to recognize the signs. You learn to protect yourself. Theodore is still in jail. He serves his sentence in a federal penitentiary. He will never be released while I'm alive. His sentence is long enough that when he gets out, he'll be a very old man. But that doesn't bring me peace, because real peace would have come if that had never happened. Real peace would be if I had recognized the signs earlier. Real peace would be if those other women hadn't gone through what they went through. So now I use my voice, I use my story, I talk about chronic poisoning, about domestic abuse, about how relationships that seem perfect can hide horrible secrets. Because if my story can save one person, if my story can make someone recognize signs of poisoning or abuse, if my story can make a woman trust her instinct and seek help, then the 5 years I spent drinking poisoned coffee weren't completely in vain. I am Mirabelle. I am 71 years old. I am a survivor, and this is my story. But before you leave here, I wanted to ask again that you like this video, that you subscribe to the Grandma's Diary channel if you haven't subscribed yet, because stories like mine need to be heard, need to be seen, need to awaken people. Tell me also in the comments where you're watching from, what state, what country. I love knowing that this story is reaching people from all places, that it's touching lives, that it's saving people. If you know someone who might be going through something similar, share this story, because awareness is the first tool against abuse. Because many times, the difference between life and death is recognizing the signs in time. Thank you for listening to me until the end. Thank you for following my journey. Thank you for believing in me.